Number 5. Jane Doe 193 UFNY. On December 6, 1983, a woman's body was found in a ditch near Ellery, New York. She had been shot 4 times, once in the mouth, once in the back, and twice in the chest. The woman was wearing an expensive, high-quality red trench coat that only had European sizing on the tag. When the police searched the body, they found that the woman had no identification. What they did find was a note that was written on stationery from the Blue Boy Motor Hotel, which was a seedy hotel that was located 2,400 miles away in Vancouver, British Columbia. The note, which is on the screen now, contains several initials, abbreviations, and numbers. The police are unsure if the note is connected to the murder, but it is one of the few pieces of evidence that they do have in the case. They also have DNA from the victim, who is called Jane Doe 193 UFNY. Her DNA and her fingerprints were added to the FBI's CODIS DNA database and the U.S. Justice Department's NamUs database. Unfortunately, neither her DNA nor her fingerprints were a match to any missing persons in the two systems. The police believe that the woman most likely lived in Canada or Europe, at least for an extended period of time, because she was using an IUD birth control device that was manufactured in Europe but only sold in Canada and Europe and not in the United States. It also appears that she had dental work done in Europe as well. Other than that, not much is known about Jane Doe 193 UFNY, let alone who shot her 4 times and left her body in a ditch to rot. Number 4. The Circleville Rider. Circleville, Ohio is a small city about an hour's drive from Columbus, and it is home to a series of disturbing crimes. Starting in 1976, several of the town's 12,000 residents started receiving letters written in distinctive block letters. All of the letters were unsettling because they included personal details about the recipients. Many of the letters also accused the recipient of doing something illegal or immoral. Most of the letters closed with threats, and at times they were directed at the recipient's children. One person who seemed to get the brunt of the writer's attention was school bus driver Mary Gillespie. She was the first known person to get a letter, and it accused her of having an affair with the superintendent of the schools. She was told to end the affair or there would be dire consequences. The writer also said that he or she was watching the house and they knew about Mary's children. At first, Mary ignored the letter, thinking it was just a disturbing prank, but then 2 more letters came. After her husband Ron received a letter from the mysterious writer, she came forth with her letters. She said that she wasn't having an affair and she had no idea who the writer was. Ron and Mary discussed the letters with some family members, and they thought they figured out who was sending them. They wrote a letter of their own telling the person to stop it, and for a while the letters did stop. But that is when the case took a tragic turn. On the night of August 19, 1977, Ron Gillespie got a phone call. Apparently, the caller gave the identity of the writer. Ron hung up the phone, grabbed his handgun, and drove off in his pickup truck to confront the writer without telling anyone who he was. Unfortunately, Ron was killed on the way to the confrontation after his car slammed into a tree. An autopsy was performed, and the coroner found Ron's blood alcohol level to be twice the legal limit. One oddity about the crash that the police did note was that Ron's gun had fired 1 bullet. After the crash, the police began to look into the letters. The police interviewed the man that Ron and Mary wrote the letter to, but they ruled him out as a suspect. Since Ron didn't say who he was going to confront, it's unclear if he was going to confront the man that they sent the letter to, or if he was going to confront the real writer. Despite the fact that a man lost his life and the police were now investigating the letters, they didn't stop. In the 1980s, politicians and residents of Circleville were flooded with thousands of threatening letters written in distinctive block letters. However, the writer hadn't forgotten about Mary Gillespie. After her husband's death, Mary announced that she was in a relationship with the school superintendent that the writer accused her of having the affair with. Mary claimed that the relationship only started after she became a widow. In 1983, Mary was driving her school bus route, which included a country road, and that is when she saw some big signs posted along the side of the road threatening her. When Mary saw one that threatened her daughter, she stopped the bus and tore the sign down. After doing so, Mary discovered that the sign had a string tied to it. She followed the string and the other end went into a box that was attached to a pole. She tore open the box and inside was a small pistol. The police were called and they concluded that it was a trap. The gun was supposed to shoot Mary once she pulled the sign down. The gun's serial number had been filed off, but the police were able to trace it back to a man named Paul Freshour, who was married to Ron Gillespie's sister, making him Mary's brother-in-law. He was brought in for questioning and he told the police that his gun had been stolen months before. He also denied being the writer and he voluntarily did a handwriting analysis test. The police concluded that Freshour's handwriting was similar, so he was charged with attempted murder. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. However, the letters didn't stop with Freischauer in prison. They were still being mailed out at an alarming rate to the residents of Circleville. In an effort to stop the letters, Freischauer was put into solitary confinement and his mail was monitored. Even this didn't stop the letters, which were being mailed out from Columbus, and Paul was in prison 90 miles away in Lima. Freischauer sat in prison, sometimes in solitary confinement, for 7 years, and then he was finally able to apply for parole. However, he was denied because people were still getting threatening letters with the distinctive block letters. After his parole was denied, Freischauer got a letter himself, which read, "Now when are you going to believe you aren't going to get out of there? I told you 2 years ago. When we set them up, they stay set up. Don't you listen at all?" In total, Freischauer spent 10 years in prison. The letters continued on into the 1990s when they finally came to an end as mysteriously as they started. Paul Freischauer always denied that he was the Circleville writer, and he died on June 28, 2012. Number 3. Wayne Gravett. On December 12, 1996, 42-year-old Wayne Gravett found a package in his mailbox that was delivered by Canada Post. He carried the package, which looked like a Christmas present, into his house in rural Moffat, Ontario. Inside the box, there was a letter written on a typewriter, some crumpled up flyers, and a flashlight. When Gravett flicked on the flashlight, it exploded, and he was killed instantly in front of his wife and 21-year-old son. The police were called, and they concluded that someone had made a bomb and disguised it as a flashlight. One major clue in the murder of Gravett was the note that was found in the box. It was written on a Smith Corona typewriter, model 10/12, number 59543. It was addressed to Gravett, and it was a business proposal. The writer said that they were planning on opening a new business called Acton Home Products, and they wanted a quote from Gravett. They also said that they had worked with Gravett in the past. In the last paragraph, the writer says that he plans to open the business in the new year and is excited to hear from Gravett. The letter writer signs off as William J. French, and there is an address in Acton, Ontario, which is a community about 20 minutes away from Gravett's farm. Finally, and most hauntingly, the postscript of the letter says, "Have a very Merry Christmas, and may you never have to buy another flashlight." The police are completely baffled as to why Gravett was targeted and who was responsible for his brutal murder. Number 2. The Tynong North Serial Killer. Originally, the police thought that the first victim of the Tynong North serial killer was 74-year-old Bertha Miller, who vanished on her way to church on August 20th, 1980. She was supposed to walk to a tram stop, which was about 1,300 feet away from her house in Glen Iris, Victoria, Australia. Then, 18 days later on the morning of March 28, 1980, 14-year-old Catherine Headland went to catch a bus to go to her part-time job. When she didn't show up to work, the police were notified. Searches were launched, but Catherine could not be found. In October 1980, 18-year-old Anne-Marie Sargent was kidnapped when she went to catch public transportation. Then, in November 1980, 34-year-old Narumo Stevenson from Northkit disappeared without a trace. The disappearance of the 4 women would stay a mystery until December 6, 1980. That's when the police were called to bushland in Tynong North. A man dumping an animal carcass came across the decomposing bodies of 3 women. They were identified as Bertha Miller, Catherine Headland, and Anne-Marie Sargent. Catherine and Anne-Marie were both nude, but Bertha was fully clothed. A couple of months later, the body of Narumo Stevenson was found about a mile away from where the other 3 women were dumped. Like Catherine and Anne-Marie, she was nude. Since there was so much decomposition, the police are unsure how the women died, but they are pretty sure that all the murders were committed by the same individual or the same group of people. They also believe that the same person, or persons, were responsible for 2 other abduction murders in Frankston, another suburb of Victoria. 59-year-old Alison Rook was kidnapped near her home on May 30th, 1980, which would make her the killer's first victim. Then, on October 9th, 1981, Caramel Summers, 55, also went missing from Frankston. Both women went missing while waiting for public transportation, and both of their bodies were found a short distance away in bushland in Frankston North, about 25 miles from where the other 4 bodies were found in Tynong North. 8 years ticked by, and the police still had no idea who the killer was. They had several suspects, but no arrests were made. That's when Catherine Headland's mother received a disturbing handwritten anonymous Christmas card with terrible grammar and spelling that reads, "I hope in writing to you I do not cause you or your family any stress. I can comprehend the pain, the agony you have to endure to lose a loved one, Catherine, not knowing when or if the perpetrators will ever be caught. Well, the new year may be good for you. Things may unfold. The name of the perpetrator, whose deeds make Tarot look like kid stuff. P.S. I'll keep in touch, sometime in the new year. A non-friend." Tarot is a reference to an infamous series of 7 murders committed over 2 months in 1976 and 1977 by Christopher Robin Worrell and James William Miller in Tarot, South Australia. 5 months after the Christmas card was mailed to the mother of the murdered 14-year-old, the police chief commissioner in Melbourne got a strange anonymous letter regarding the case. It was postmarked May 1st, 1989, and it was typewritten. Just like the Christmas card, it was full of spelling and grammatical errors. It reads, "Is the Tynong file gathering dust? Have you ran into a dead end? Need help? With a multitude of questions, but very few answers? Did you know you are dealing with mass murder in a scale never seen in this country? Only the top American serial killers surpass this cold-blooded killer. Did you know was another victim, and others across 3 states? Did you find the brooch that Miller was wearing on the day of the murder, or the pair of sterling silver blue earrings belonging to Catherine?" What made this note so interesting to the police was that the missing jewelry was not public information and is probably something that only the killer would have known about. So the police believe that the author may be the actual killer. For that reason, the police tracked down the very typewriter that the letter was written on. It belonged to a convicted armed robber who was serving time in prison. However, they were able to confirm that he didn't write the letter, and they are not sure who the author is. Since those letters, the killer has gone quiet. Over 2,000 people have been interviewed in connection with the 6 murders, but no one has ever been charged. Number 1. April Tinsley. On April 1st, 1988, 8-year-old April Tinsley was playing with 2 friends in a quiet neighborhood in Fort Wayne, Indiana. At some point, they moved to a different house, but April forgot her umbrella. She left her friends to go retrieve it, and sadly, as she moved between houses, she was kidnapped. Her body was found 3 days later in a ditch in rural Amish country, not far from her home. Sadly, she had been raped and suffocated. Also dumped near the body was a sex toy in a Sears bag. Eyewitnesses said that they saw a man in the area where April was kidnapped. Based on their description, this sketch was developed and released to the public. At the time, he was driving a light blue pickup truck. Unfortunately, the sketch didn't turn up any suspects. 2 years later, the police were called to a farm about 10 miles away from April's home. On the doors of a barn, someone had written a message in marker claiming responsibility for the murder of April Tinsley. The writer also said that he would kill again. At the time, the police were unsure if the killer actually wrote it or if it was just a sick prank. Luckily, the writer didn't follow through with his threat, and he went quiet for the next 14 years. Then, out of the blue in April 2004, 4 notes written on yellow-lined paper were found in Fort Wayne, Indiana. One of them was found in a mailbox, but the other 3 were found on the bikes of little girls. One note that was found in the basket of a 5-year-old girl's bike was released to the media. The letter, which is a bit difficult to read, is believed to say, "Hi honey, I've been watching you. I am the same person that kidnap and rape and kill April Tinsley. You are my next victim. If you don't report this to the police, or I don't see this in the paper tomorrow or on the local news, or I will blow up your house." Included with the letters were disturbing souvenirs, which the writer called gifts. This included Polaroid pictures of the killer's body and a used condom. DNA was taken from the condom and tested against the DNA pulled from April's body, and they concluded that it was a match. However, the DNA didn't match any known offenders. In 2015, this composite sketch was developed based on the DNA. The FBI are currently looking for someone between the ages of 45 and 55 who looks like the man in this picture. They are also looking for help in identifying someone who was living in the Fort Wayne area that was still using a Polaroid camera in 2004 and owned a green bedspread like the one in this picture. This bedspread was in the background of the Polaroid picture that was left with one of the letters. The police hope that the mystery will be solved to give April's family some closure and to get a dangerous man off the street. Number 5. Roger Dean. After waking up on the morning of November 21st, 1985, Doris Jean Dean, who went by DJ, had a bath in her upscale home in Lone Tree, Colorado. As she was getting out of the tub, her husband, 51-year-old Roger Dean, told her that she needed to come into the bedroom. When she did, she was startled because a man wearing a balaclava was aiming a gun at Roger. The masked man ordered Roger to tie up DJ and then to put duct tape over her eyes. Roger complied, and then he was led to a different room across the hall. The man kept coming back into the bedroom and asking DJ how much money Roger had in his bank account, but she didn't know. The 3rd time the man came into the bedroom, Roger tried to run away. There was a scuffle, and Roger screamed, "I'll give you the 30,000, you," but he was cut off by a gunshot. It was meant to be a warning shot, but the bullet ricocheted and struck Roger. Now bleeding, Roger ran down the stairs and the gunman chased him. He fired another shot inside the house and Roger was hit again. Then, as Roger lay at the end of his driveway, the masked man shot him 4 more times while his neighbors watched on. The masked man then ran to a car that was parked a block away and drove off. Sadly, Roger was pronounced dead just an hour later in the hospital. Immediately, the police noticed a few oddities with the case. First, Roger usually left for work at 6:15 a.m., but on the morning that he died, he was seen drinking coffee in his garage at around 7 a.m. Secondly, he only had rope tied around one wrist. Also, when he was taken to the hospital, he was wearing contact lenses, but his glasses had duct tape on them. Finally, Roger just had opened a bank account and put $32,000 in it. This led police to believe that Roger knew the gunman and set up the robbery himself. The theory is that Roger let in his killer through the garage. The gunman was supposed to take Roger to the bank, withdraw the money, and then Roger would claim the money was stolen. Instead, something went horribly wrong and Roger ended up dead. A short time after Roger's murder, his daughter, Tamara, started to get threatening phone calls. The calls were so bad that she and her husband ended up moving to Arizona. She stayed away for 5 years before returning to Lone Tree to help out her mother. Not long after her return, DJ got 2 threatening letters. The author said that he was the killer, and he gave personal details about the Dean family and the murder. In the letter, the writer demanded $100,000. Part of the letter reads, "Do you know that I have met your daughter Tammy on a few occasions? Do not make me kill her. Your son is dead, your husband is dead. Do not risk your daughter. She is the last one left." Investigators thought that since the letter referenced the fact that the Deans lost their son in a train accident 2 years before Roger was shot, that he may know the Dean family well. Finally, the author said that he would call in 6 days. True to his word, the writer called DJ on July 27, 1990, and she agreed to pay him $100,000. The call was traced to a phone booth in Denver, but no one was around it when the police went to the phone booth. The person called DJ a dozen times, and twice he gave her a place to drop the money. Both times DJ dropped the money while the FBI and the police watched on. However, no one picked it up. Instead, the writer made one last phone call to Tamara. He said that he would kill her when she least expected it. He said that he was patient and eventually the police would stop watching. Luckily, the caller never acted on his threats. There are currently 3 theories about the murder and the mysterious calls and letters that came afterwards. The first is that the killer and the extortionist are 2 completely different people. The extortionist may have known the family well and tried to use the tragedy as an opportunity to get some money. The second theory is that the extortionist knows the killer, and the killer told him personal details about the family and the crime. The third is that the killer and the extortionist are the same person. One last thing to note about the letter is that an analysis was performed on it, and it suggested that a man and a woman wrote the letter together. The police have DNA from the shooter, and it has been inputted into federal databases, but unfortunately they have not been able to find a match. The police also have 6 suspects, but none of them are willing to give up their DNA without a warrant, and the police do not have enough evidence to get a warrant. The police said that the shooter was a white man about 6 feet tall, and he is between the ages of 20 and 40. Number 4. Baby Parker. On July 28, 2005, a woman was walking her dog in a wooded area off of Parkside Drive in Brantford, Ontario, when she made a startling discovery. Wrapped in a towel was the nude body of a newborn baby boy. A short time after the baby was discovered, a man who lived near the park called the police and told them that he found a bloody object in his yard. It was later identified as the placenta. An autopsy was performed and the cause of death hasn't been released, but the baby was born alive and suffered trauma to his ribs and his skull. A week after the body was found, the police received a 3-page letter from someone who described themselves as a young girl. She said that she got pregnant after having sex with one of the guys in the neighborhood, but she didn't know who the father of the baby was. She said that she kept the pregnancy secret, and on the night that the baby was born, she was at the park partying with a friend when the contractions started. She went into labor, and her friend helped deliver the baby in the park. The mother didn't know the sex of the baby, but her friend said that the baby was dead. The friend then went and placed the body in some bushes, and the friend also got rid of the placenta, but the writer wasn't sure what she did with it. The letter closes with the writer begging the police not to do any DNA testing because she doesn't want anyone, especially the father, to know about the baby. She said that she needed a week to build up the courage and then she would turn herself in. However, she never has. Obviously, the police took DNA samples from the baby, but after testing 100 people, they have not found either parent. The police also have fingerprints from the letter, but like the DNA, it has not turned up a match. Today, the case is cold, but the police are hoping that the conscience of the mother or the friend who helped deliver the baby will force them to come forward and confess. Number 3. The Fort Worth 3. 2 days before Christmas, in 1974, 17-year-old Mary Rachel Trickla, who went by her middle name, picked up her 14-year-old friend, Lisa Renee Wilson, and Lisa's neighbor's 9-year-old granddaughter, Julie Mosley. First, the girls picked up some presents that were on layaway at an Army-Navy store, and then they went to the Seminary South shopping center in Fort Worth, Texas. They were supposed to return home later that afternoon, but they didn't. Their car was found in the upper level of the Sears parking lot. It was locked, and inside were Christmas presents. The police were called, but they assumed that the girls had just run away. The day after the girls were last seen, Rachel's husband, Tommy Trickla, received a letter in the mail. The envelope was addressed to Thomas A. Trickla, and the envelope had the name Rachel on the top left-hand corner. The postmark didn't give a city, instead there was a blurry zip code, which was 76083. What was interesting about the postmark was that the 3 was backwards, meaning that the hand stamp could have been loaded upside down, which would mean that the last 2 digits should be switched, making the zip code actually 76038. However, neither of those are zip codes in Texas. Another possibility is that the number should be an 8 and is just missing its left side. That would make the zip code 76088, which is the zip code for Weatherford, a city about 45 miles away from the mall where the girls were last seen. Inside the envelope was a piece of paper that was too wide for the envelope. The handwriting was childlike, and it reads, "I know I'm going to catch it, but we just had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in Sears upper lot. Love, Rachel." The author of the letter also messed up the spelling on Rachel. Originally the L at the end of the name looked like a lowercase e, and then the person went back over to make it look like an L. Another problem with the letter was that Rachel never called her husband Thomas, she always called him Tommy. So he thought that it was very odd that Rachel would address the letter to Thomas instead of Tommy. Handwriting analyses were performed on the letter, but they have been inconclusive. Tommy and Rachel's mom do not believe that Rachel wrote the letter. The police think that after Christmas shopping, the girls went back to their car and dropped off the presents. When they did, they ran into someone they knew and they went with them. After leaving the mall, they most likely met with foul play. Over the years, there have been several sightings of the girls, but nothing has ever been confirmed. The families of the girls believe they are dead and want to know what happened to them so they can get some closure. Some of the families also believe that Rachel's sister Deborah may know something about the disappearances. Deborah and Tommy had been engaged before he and Rachel got married. She was also living with Rachel and Tommy when the girls disappeared. She was at the home on the day the girls went to the mall, and she was there the morning Tommy got the letter. She has denied any knowledge of what happened to the girls, and she thinks that they were sold into slavery. The police were able to pull DNA from the letter, but there isn't a match on record, and currently the case is cold. Number 2. Nylene K. Marshall. On the afternoon of June 25, 1978, 4-year-old Nylene K. Marshall was at a family outing in Helena National Park near her hometown of Clancy, Montana. Nylene, who was barefoot, was playing with some other children. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the other children were walking ahead of Nylene, and when they turned around, she was gone. For the next 10 days, search teams looked for the 4-year-old. They thought it was possible that she wandered off into the wilderness and got lost. However, since she wasn't wearing shoes, she probably couldn't have gone too far. Yet, they were unable to find any trace of her. Then, in 1983, the police who were working on the disappearance got an anonymous letter. It was typewritten and it was postmarked Madison, Wisconsin, which is about 1,300 miles away from where Nylene disappeared. In the letter, the writer said that he picked up a girl named Kay, which is Nylene's middle name. The writer said that he worked from home and had a good income investment. He homeschooled Kay, and he also apparently traveled with her around the United States and abroad to Canada and the United Kingdom. He also knew that Nylene's family missed her, but he loved her too much to give her back. What made the letter so terrifying was that it included details about the case that only the kidnapper would know. After the letter, a man claiming to be the author called Child Find Network, which was a hotline for missing kids, and he talked about Nylene. What the man said has never been made public, but the caller apparently alluded to sexual abuse. One of the calls was traced to a phone booth outside of a pharmacy in Edgerton, Wisconsin, which is about 30 miles away from Madison, where the letter was postmarked. Luckily, this story does have one bright spot. When Nylene's story aired on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries in November 1990, a boy in Port Roberts, Washington thought that his classmate was Nylene. The girl wasn't Nylene, but in an amazing twist of fate, the girl was actually a different kidnapped victim. Her name was Monica Bonilla. She had been kidnapped by her non-custodial father in 1982, when she was just 5 years old. After being missing for 8 years, Monica was reunited with her mother, who had spent years and $20,000 searching for her. Unfortunately, no trace of Nylene has ever been found, and sadly, Nylene's mother, Nancy, never learned the fate of her daughter. She was murdered in Mexico in July 1995. Number 1. The 3X Killer. On July 11, 1930, grocer Joseph Mazinski was in a car in the secluded Lover's Lane in Queens, New York, with 19-year-old Catherine May. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a man walked up to the car, pulled out a gun, and executed Mosinski. The man then forced May out of the car, and she was raped. Afterwards, the killer took her purse and pulled out some letters, and then burned them. He then walked May to catch a trolley, and just before she boarded, the man stuffed a note in her hand that read, Joseph Mosinski, 3X3-X-097. It looked like the wording had been stamped on with a rubber stamp, and the ink was crimson colored. 2 days later, the local newspaper received a letter which said, "Kindly print this letter in your paper for Mosinski's friends. CC-NY-ADCM-Y16A-DQR-PA 241 PM6 Queens. By doing this, you may save their lives. We do not want any more shooting unless we have to." The next day, a second letter came, and it said that Mosinski was a dirty rat. The author also described in detail the murder, including the make of the gun and what ammo he used. He said that Mosinski was killed over some papers that the killer thought he had, but he said that he didn't find the papers he was looking for. He then demanded that the documents that he was looking for be delivered to him, or 14 of Mosinski's friends would die. 2 days after the second letter was received, another couple was parking in a lover's lane in Queens. The man approached the car and demanded to see Noel Soley's driver's license. The man then used the flashlight and seemingly flashed a code out into the darkness. The man then said, "Yeah, you're the one we want, alright. You're going to get what Joe got." He then pulled out a gun and shot Soley to death. After murdering him, the man rifled through Soley's pockets before turning to Elizabeth Ring, who was in the car with Soley. She held up a religious medallion, which possibly kept her safe because she wasn't harmed, but she was left with a cryptic note. The contents of that note have never been made public. The day after the second murder, the newspaper received 2 spent shell casings from the murderer, along with a note. The note said that V. Soley was a friend of Mosinski's. The author now said that 13 friends of Mosinski would die, along with a woman, if they did not make peace. Later, on June 21st, Mosinski's brother got a letter pressuring him to give up the papers. The final letter from the gunman was delivered to the police a short time later. In the letters, he confesses to the crimes in a long, rambling letter. He said that he was a member of the Red Diamond of Russia, which was an anti-communist group. The author said that the last document, NJ4-3-44, had been returned to him on the 19th at 9 p.m. There was no reason to worry anymore because the killings would stop. And with that, the killer disappeared, and no one has ever been arrested for the mysterious string of murders. Number 3. Samuel Lottery. London, Ontario is the midway point between Detroit, Michigan, and Toronto, Ontario. It is a quiet city, and in the 1990s it had a population of just over 300,000 people. On January 18, 1996, Samuel Lottery, an 18-year-old high school student, failed to return home. His family alerted the police, but Lottery was nowhere to be found. A month later, Lottery was still missing. That's when an envelope was dropped off at the church where his family worshiped. Inside the envelope was a letter and a picture. His family recognized the photograph because it was one that Lottery kept in his wallet. The letter was written on unique stationery, and the complete contents of the letter have never been released. What is known is that the writer suggested that the police should look in the Thames River, which is the main river that runs through the city. The police did a search of the Thames, and they didn't find any trace of Lottery. 6 months later, the family received a second letter that was written on the same stationery. This time, the letter was mailed to their house. Again, the writer said to search the river. The police searched again, but just like last time, they found no trace of Lottery. 16 months after Lottery went missing, a man was walking his dog near the Thames River, and his dog found a human arm bone. He contacted the police and they found some more bones close by, but they did not find a complete skeleton. They sent the bones away to be tested, and 19 months later the results came back and confirmed what Lottery's mother had feared. The bones belonged to her son, meaning that he was most likely dead. They were hoping to find more of his remains in the area, but nothing else ever turned up. About 3 years after some of his bones were found, his family buried the remains that they did have, and they tried their best to move on with their lives. Then, 12 years after he went missing, Lottery's skull was found about a mile and a half down the river from the other skeletal remains. The discovery reopened old wounds for Lottery's family, but it failed to provide any clues as to what happened to him. The police in London are fairly certain that Lottery was a victim of foul play. Their investigation has led them to believe that Lottery had been specifically targeted. They are also sure that the letter writer was involved in the murder in some way, or knows someone who was involved. The police are hoping that the killer, or killers, will come forward, or someone who recognizes the stationery will contact the police so that Samuel Lottery's family may finally get some closure. Number 2. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. By November 1987, 20-year-old Jay Cook and 18-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg had been dating for about 6 months. The couple, who both lived at home with their parents in Victoria, British Columbia, were inseparable, and on November 18th they left to go on their first overnight trip. They borrowed Cook's father's van, and they were going to drive to Seattle to camp, and then they were going to pick up some furnace parts for Cook's father. They took a ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, Washington, and then they took another ferry from Bremerton to Seattle. The next evening, the couple hadn't returned home and the family started to worry. After a sleepless night, they contacted the police. 4 days later, Van Cuylenborg's body was found in a ditch near Alger, Washington, which is about 76 miles away from where they got off the ferry in Seattle. She was partially clothed and her hands were bound with a zip tie. She had been sexually assaulted and then she was shot to death. The next day, her wallet was found, along with more zip ties, surgical gloves, the keys to the van, and a half-empty box of ammunition, and they were found 14 miles away in Bellingham. 2 blocks away from the wallet, at the Greyhound bus station, the van was located, but there was still no sign of Jay. The police warned Cook's parents that he might be the one responsible for the murder, and he fled. His parents knew that he wasn't a killer, and they got confirmation in the most tragic way possible the day after the van was found. Cook's body was found by hunters near Monroe, about 62 miles south of where Van Cuylenborg's body was found. He had been beaten and strangled to death. The police think that the couple either met their killer, or killers, on the ferry, where they picked up a hitchhiker or hitchhikers. They also believe that Cook was killed and dumped before Van Cuylenborg was murdered. Based on where the bodies were found, the police have speculated that the killer was local to the area and knew the back roads. Finally, the police think that he was taunting them by leaving behind the surgical gloves. It was a way to tell them that they weren't going to find any fingerprints. A week after the bodies were discovered, Cook and Van Cuylenborg's parents each received a disturbing letter in the mail. The author of the letter wrote about how he hated Canadians, and the chance to kill the couple was too good to pass up. Then, once a month over the next year, both sets of parents received a letter, or for holidays like Father's Day and Mother's Day, he sent them Hallmark greeting cards. Sometimes he would sign off the cards as Jay or Tanya, depending on what parent he sent the card to. Besides taking credit for the murders, the writer would taunt and mock the parents for the loss of their children. He also sent letters to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and a newspaper in British Columbia. The postmark of the first letter was from Seattle, but over the year the cards and letters were postmarked in Los Angeles, New York, and Canada. This led to speculation that the letter writer may be a transient. The police also think that he may have been educated in Canada because of certain phrases he wrote and the way he spelled certain words. In 2010, the police were able to pull some DNA from the letters, and a profile was created. It was compared to the DNA profile constructed from evidence that was found on Van Cuylenborg, and it was not a match. So there is a good chance that the letter writer is just a sadistic prankster. However, they think it's odd that he focused on the family for a year, so they think it's quite possible that he was involved in the murders in some way. The police said if the letter writer wasn't involved in the murders, he wouldn't face any charges if he turned himself in. They just want to eliminate him as a suspect if he didn't participate in the murders of the young couple. As was mentioned prior, the police do have a DNA sample that was found on Van Cuylenborg, but it has not been linked to anyone. The police do not think that this is the only violent crime that the perpetrator committed, but the DNA has not been linked to any other crimes. The police and the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg are hoping that one day the person who left the DNA at the crime scene will have their DNA entered into CODIS and finally give some closure to the case. Number 1. Cecilia Newball and Rene Perez Jr. On September 18, 1994, 31-year-old Cecilia Newball and her husband, Alfredo Newball, who lived in the Chatsworth neighborhood of Los Angeles, celebrated their first wedding anniversary. On their anniversary, friends and family threw Cecilia, who was 8.5 months pregnant, a surprise wedding shower. 2 days later, Alfredo left for work, leaving Cecilia at home with her 6-year-old son, Ray Perez Jr., who was Alfredo's stepson. Cecilia, who was on maternity leave, said that she was going to stay home and write thank you cards for the wedding shower. Alfredo started his shift at 2:30 p.m. and on his lunch break he called home, but there was no answer. When he returned home later that evening, he discovered that Cecilia and Rene weren't there. There were no messages inside the apartment indicating where they went. When Alfredo was driving home, he saw Cecilia's Jeep parked in the street instead of in their secure parking lot. So he decided to check her Jeep to see if there were any clues to her whereabouts. Inside the Jeep there was a farewell card, and the only thing written in the card was Cecilia's signature. Inside the card there was a picture of Renee. In the passenger seat there was her wedding ring and her engagement ring. A week later, Alfredo got an envelope in the mail that was postmarked in Van Nuys, California. It contained a second identical farewell card. This time with the card there was a letter that was typewritten. The writer claimed to be Cecilia. The letter said that she was leaving Alfredo for a doctor named Arturo. They were moving to Honduras and she was taking Rene with her. When Alfredo read over the letter a few times, he knew that something was wrong. First off, if Cecilia were to write a letter that personal, she wouldn't have typewritten in it. Also, Cecilia didn't take a change of clothes for herself or for Rene or his eyeglasses. Finally, the couple weren't having any problems, and Cecilia was excited about the baby. So Alfredo didn't think that she would just take off. Despite being aware of these problems, Alfredo didn't contact the police. Instead, one of Cecilia's relatives called the police and they began to investigate. The police immediately thought that Alfredo was acting strangely and sometimes indifferent. However, a reporter with the Los Angeles Times who interviewed Alfredo said that he was very distraught over his missing wife and stepson. Also, there was no physical evidence that suggested that he had anything to do with the disappearances, so the police began interviewing friends and family of the couple. Everyone said that it didn't appear that Alfredo and Cecilia were having marital problems. After the interviews, the police think that a third party may be involved because they learned that Cecilia had received 2 strange phone calls in the months before she disappeared. The first one happened 6 months before she went missing. It was a woman calling, and she said that she had a video recording of Alfredo kissing another woman at a baby shower and thought that Cecilia should see the video. Cecilia agreed, and the unidentified woman was supposed to call back to arrange a meeting, but she never did. Then, just weeks before she went missing, a woman called and said that she worked with Alfredo. She said that Alfredo's co-workers were planning a surprise baby shower for him, and the woman wanted Cecilia to meet up with her to pick out a piece of furniture. She told Cecilia to keep it a secret from Alfredo, and the police only found out about the call because Cecilia had told a friend about it. The day that they were supposed to meet was the day that Cecilia and Rene went missing. So the police interviewed Alfredo's co-workers. None of them made the call, and they weren't planning a baby shower for Alfredo. The police think that the call was a way to lure Cecilia away from her home so she would be easier to abduct. The police have speculated that the caller is somehow connected to Alfredo, but there is no evidence to back that up. Besides Alfredo, the next most obvious suspect was Rene's father, Rene Perez Sr. The police interviewed him, and he said that he had nothing to do with the disappearances, and he had an airtight alibi. According to an article in the Los Angeles Times, Rene Sr. ended up moving in with Alfredo. The article went on to say that both men were grief-stricken and felt hopeless, so they prayed together often. Sadly, their prayers have never been answered, and the whereabouts of Cecilia Newball and Rene Perez Jr. are still unknown. Number 3. Thomas Wales. Thomas Wales was born in Boston, Massachusetts in June 1952. He attended the Milton Academy, which is a boarding school in Milton, Massachusetts. While he boarded there, his roommate was Joseph Kennedy II, the eldest son of Robert Kennedy. Kennedy would go on to serve as congressman for Massachusetts from 1987 to 1999. When Thomas was 16, he met 16-year-old Elizabeth, who also attended Milton, and they started dating. Thomas went on to Harvard after graduating from Milton. When Thomas was 21, he and Elizabeth got married. After he graduated from Harvard, Thomas attended Hofstra Law School. The same year that Thomas finished law school, Elizabeth gave birth to a son. 2 years later, she gave birth to a daughter. In 1983, Thomas was hired by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Seattle, Washington. The family moved into a 1905 craftsman-style house in a quiet neighborhood named Queen Anne. In January 1995, something happened that completely altered the course of Thomas's life. At the time, his son was attending a public high school. On January 12th, a 15-year-old student at the school felt like he was being picked on by another student. The 15-year-old boy went home, and he grabbed a 9mm handgun. He returned to school, and he shot 2 students. Both were wounded, but they survived the shooting. Thomas's son wasn't involved in the shooting, but the fact that a kid could easily get a gun and shoot other students at school deeply disturbed him. Not long after the shooting, Thomas joined Ceasefire, which is a Washington-based gun control advocacy group. He eventually became the president of Ceasefire, and he held the position for over a decade. In the year 2000, Thomas's wife Elizabeth came out as gay, and she wanted to end their 27-year marriage. Elizabeth, who runs her own literary agency, said that it took a while for Thomas to come to terms with everything. Elizabeth said he eventually did, and he was supportive of her. She said that they remained best friends after their separation. By the fall of 2001, Thomas had been with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Seattle for 18 years. He prosecuted white-collar crimes like bank fraud. By all accounts, he was incredibly passionate about prosecuting people who abused their privilege. In his 18-year career, Thomas had not lost a single case. On the evening of October 11, 2001, Thomas was supposed to have dinner with his girlfriend, who owned a court reporting business. But earlier that day, he called and canceled their date, saying he had work to do at home. Shortly before 7 p.m., Thomas left his office and drove home. He was living alone in the house in Queen Anne. Elizabeth had moved out when they separated, and their children were away at university in Europe. At 10:40 p.m., gunshots shattered the quiet of the night. Several calls came into 911, and the callers said that the shots came from Thomas's house. First responders raced to the house, and in the office basement of Thomas's home, they found him bleeding to death. Paramedics worked on him for an hour in the office, and then he was transported to the hospital. But sadly, nothing could be done for him. 49-year-old Thomas Wales was pronounced dead at 1:17 a.m. He had been shot 4 or 5 times in the back. The FBI has not revealed exactly how many times Thomas was shot. The killer took the gun with him, but left the shells behind. The caliber of gun used in the murder was a .380. The killer had gotten into Thomas's backyard, snuck by the security lights, and shot Thomas in the back through a window as he sat at his computer. Since it was 10:40 at night, it was dark outside, and Thomas was writing emails in his office with the lights on. The killer would have been able to see Thomas working on his computer, but Thomas would have had no idea that the killer was lurking outside of his window. The neighbor whose backyard backed onto Thomas's backyard said she saw a man walking quickly towards a car just minutes after the gunshots. She gave a description of the man that resulted in this sketch. The FBI was called in, and they worked with the Seattle police. They were quickly able to clear the people who are usual suspects in the murder, including his ex-wife, his girlfriend, and his children. Some people thought that Thomas's murder was some type of terrorist attack because he was shot on October 11, 2001, a month after the 9/11 attacks. But Thomas was an attorney who prosecuted white-collar crimes, so he seemed like an unlikely choice for a terrorist assassination. The next logical explanation was that he was killed in revenge for a case they prosecuted. While Thomas didn't handle violent crimes, he had sent people to prison, so the police and the FBI thought it was a viable motive. They even had a suspect, a commercial airline pilot named James Anderson. Besides being a pilot, Anderson and a partner owned a company that was converting a military helicopter into a civilian helicopter. Anderson and his partner were going to spend $600,000 converting the helicopter, and then they planned to sell it for $1.2 million. In 2000, Thomas filed 8 indictments against Anderson and his partner for crimes like mail fraud and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The indictments allege that to get the helicopter certified as a civilian helicopter, Anderson and his partner falsified some records. But then, in June 2001, the charges against Anderson and his partner were dismissed. A witness who was going to testify for the prosecution changed his story, and Thomas and his co-counsel did not think that they had enough evidence to prosecute Anderson and his partner. Instead, Anderson's company was charged with a minor violation involving bookkeeping. They pleaded guilty, and they paid a $1,000 fine. Even though the charges were dropped, Anderson was supposedly furious about being charged. He ended up suing the United States government because he claimed he spent $128,000 on legal fees and his reputation was ruined. His suit was ultimately dismissed. Something else that got the FBI's attention is that Anderson is an avid gun enthusiast. After the 9/11 attacks, there was some discussion if pilots should be armed with guns. Thomas, who was the president of the gun control advocacy group Ceasefire, spoke out against the idea in a half-hour televised debate. The FBI believes that Anderson became even more furious with Thomas after he spoke out against arming pilots, so he decided to kill Thomas. FBI agents asked Anderson where he was the night of the murder. He said that he went to a movie theater to see 2001: A Space Odyssey with a woman friend. The FBI agents interviewed the woman, and she confirmed that they went to the movie. The movie theater that they went to was about a 10-minute drive from Thomas's house. The woman said she left to go to her own home at 9:30 p.m. Anderson said he drove home at 9:30 as well. That was about an hour and 10 minutes before Thomas was shot. Anderson said he was home at 10:30 and he called a friend. Anderson's home was about 12 miles from Thomas's home. If Anderson obeyed the speed limits, it would have taken him about 20 minutes to drive from his house to Thomas's house. Anderson pointed out that since he made the call at 10:30 on his landline at home, he would not have had enough time to get to Thomas's to shoot him at 10:40. However, an FBI agent who worked on the case said that Anderson could have made the drive in 10 minutes. He said it would have been tight, but it wouldn't have been impossible. The FBI has searched Anderson's houses multiple times, and they made him spend 8 hours giving them handwriting samples. But the FBI has not found any incriminating evidence, so Anderson has never been charged. According to an agent who worked on the case, one of the biggest problems facing investigators is that Thomas's murder was a nearly perfect crime. The only physical evidence the killer left behind were the bullets and the shells. No DNA or fingerprints were found, so it's hard to physically link anyone to the crime. Then in January 2006, over 4 years after Thomas's murder, the FBI office in Seattle received a strange letter in the mail. The postmark was January 23, 2006, Las Vegas, Nevada. The FBI address and the return address were both handwritten. The handwriting is sloppy and childlike. The return address is a strip mall in Las Vegas. The FBI noted 3 things about the return address. The first is that the zip code is incorrect. The writer mixed up the last 2 digits. He or she wrote 89120, and it is actually 89102. The second thing they noted is that the address is on the same street as an FBI field office. The field office is 1.8 miles from the address. Finally, there is a name on the return address, and that is Gidget. Gidget is the nickname of 17-year-old Frances Lawrence, a fictional character first introduced in the 1957 novel Gidget, the Little Girl with Big Ideas by Frederick Hohner. The character's nickname, Gidget, is a combination of the words girl and midget. The book was adapted into the 1959 film Gidget. The movie stars Sandra Dee as the titular character, and is widely considered to be the first beach party movie. 7 years after the movie was released, the book was adapted into a TV series that aired for 1 season on ABC, starting in September 1966. Sally Field starred as Gidget. The original novel and the adaptations are coming-of-age stories based in the California surf culture. The FBI is not sure if the name has any significance. In the envelope was a typed letter. The letter was written using short, disjointed sentences that evoke the style of 1950s detective novels. The entire letter has not been released, but the portion that was made public reads, Ray Thomas C. Wales. Okay, so I was broke in between jobs. I got an anonymous call offering X amount of dollars to shoot the guy, so I drove to Seattle to do the job. I did not even know his name. Just got laid off from a job. Nice talking lady. I didn't know her name. She called me, talked to me by my name, and asked if I needed some money. I agreed to pursue the matter. Hell, I was going bankrupt. Go to Seattle. Heck, I lived there once. No big deal. Hang out in this guy's backyard. She even gave me the address. Stop off at a place, pick up her gun, and drop it off at a specified location when you are done. Then you will be directed to where your money is. The wife was out of town. I had no witnesses here. I was curious about who knew me so well. I used cash to pay for all my expenses to avoid an audit trail. No cell phone. I was directed to a place to pick up the gun they wanted me to use and an address. The gun was there. I drove to the address and then parked some distance away, north of downtown. I kind of camped out in the backyard of this house and waited for the guy to settle in at his computer. Once he was there, I took careful aim. I shot 2 or possibly more times and watched him collapse. I absurdly waited a few minutes and then left. I was sure he was dead. Retracing my steps, I dropped off the gun, found my money, and returned to Vegas. I feel bad about it, but I needed the money and there were no witnesses. I really don't know who fronted the money, but the X amount of dollars was there, and I sure needed it. The police checked the envelope for DNA, but it appeared that the envelope was sealed with a sponge and the stamps were self-adhesive. It's also believed that the letter was typed and printed at a copy shop. The letter does not reveal anything about the murder that wasn't already public, but the FBI still thinks it's possible that either the killer or someone involved with the crime wrote the letter. The FBI thinks that the writer wrote the letter and mailed it to possibly throw investigators off course. Or it's possible that he or she is setting up false evidence if the case were ever to go to trial. The person charged with the crime could point to the letter as evidence that they are innocent because a hitman hired by a woman had already taken credit for the murder. The police investigated Anderson's records and they discovered that he had a layover in Las Vegas around the time that the letter was sent. However, just like the murder, the FBI has never physically been able to connect Anderson to the letter. Anderson has adamantly denied being involved in the murder, and he swears he didn't send the letter. He says that the accusations have been devastating to him, both financially and emotionally. In February 2018, the FBI and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein made an announcement about the case. Friends and family of Thomas Wales were hoping that they were announcing an arrest. Unfortunately, that wasn't the announcement. Instead, they announced that the reward for information leading to an arrest is now over $1.5 million. Not long after the announcement, the Seattle Times published a quote from an FBI official who is close to the case. The official said that the FBI has found strong evidence that a hitman was probably used in the murder. But there have been no arrests since the announcement. The FBI and the Attorney General's office said that prosecuting Thomas Wales' killer remains a top priority. If Thomas Wales was murdered because of his work as a U.S. attorney, he would have a unique distinction. He would be the first federal prosecutor in the history of the United States to be killed in the line of duty. Number 2. Alessia and Livia Shep. Nadia Shep was born in July 1963 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. A month before his second birthday, his family moved to Switzerland. He grew up in Switzerland and he became an engineer. At some point, he started dating Irina Lucini, an Italian-born woman who worked as an intellectual property lawyer. In early 2004, Irina found out that she was pregnant. In July of that year, they were married in the town hall in Ascoli Piceno, Italy. On October 7, 2004, Irina gave birth to 2 daughters, Alessia and Livia. In 2006, the family moved into a nice home in Saint-Sulpice which is a suburb of Lausanne, Switzerland. Not long after moving in, Irina noticed a change in Matthias. He had become very demanding, and he only thought about himself. He also thought that he was always the victim. It eventually got to be too much for Irina, and she asked Matthias to move out. They set up a custodial schedule where Matthias would get the twins 2 days a week and every second weekend. Matthias wasn't happy with the separation. He was hoping that he and Irina could work things out, but Irina made it clear that they would never get back together. On Thursday, January 27, 2011, she sent him an email saying she wanted a divorce. The next day, Irina dropped off Alessi and Livia, who were both 6, at a ballet class. Matthias picked them up because it was his weekend to have the twins. Matthias was supposed to drop them off at Irina's house at 5 p.m. on Sunday. But on Sunday afternoon, Matthias sent Irina a text message saying he would drop them off at school on Monday morning. Irina said that was fine, but then she got a bad feeling. At about 6 p.m., she drove by Matthias's house. She saw that no one was home, and she found that odd. So she went inside, and what she found alarmed her. It was Matthias's will, which was handwritten and placed in a spot where it was easily found. She called Matthias's friends and family, but they didn't know where he or the twins were. She then called the police. Irina said the police were slow to act, and Switzerland didn't have an Amber Alert type system. On Thursday, February 3rd, 4 days after Matthias, Alessi, and Livia vanished, Irina received some shocking news. Matthias was found in Cerignola, which is a town in southeast Italy. He was dead. He had thrown himself in front of a train. The girls were not with him. Around the same time that the news of Matthias's death reached Irina, she received a disturbing postcard written by Matthias and several envelopes with money in them. The postcard was sent from Marseille, France. In the postcard, Matthias sounded despondent. He wrote, "Now is the time to finish it." Matthias also mailed her money in 7 envelopes. It was a total of 5,000 euros, or about $6,800 US. The money was withdrawn from different ATMs in Marseille. Then Irina received a letter that was sent from Bari, Italy, on the day that Matthias killed himself. In the letter, he wrote, "The children rest in peace. They have not suffered." The police investigate what Matthias did in the 4 days that he and the twins were missing. Before he absconded, Matthias did searches on the internet for firearms, poison, and suicide. He also looked up the timetables for ferries. On Sunday night, around the time he should have dropped off the girls at their mother's home, Matthias crossed the Swiss border into France. It's not known if the twins were with him. The last confirmed sighting of Alessi and Olivia was Sunday afternoon. They were seen playing in front of their father's house. On Monday, Matthias sent the postcard, and he withdrew money in Marseille, France. In total, he withdrew 7,000 euros, and he sent 5,000 of the euros to Irina. That night, he bought 3 tickets for the night ferry from Marseille to Propriano, which is on the French island of Corsica. Alessi and Livia's names were on the passenger manifest. There are conflicting reports about what happened the next morning when the ferry reached Propriano. Some witnesses said they saw Matthias with the twins that morning, while other people said he was alone when he got off the ferry. Later that day, Matthias bought 1 ticket for a ferry leaving Bastia, which is about 110 miles from Propiano. The ferry was heading to Toulon, France. 2 days later, at 10:47 p.m., Mattias threw himself in front of a train outside of Cerignola, Italy. Because of the postcard and the letter, and the fact that Mattias sent Irina money, many people believe that Mattias killed his daughters. The police in Switzerland, France, and Italy have all searched for the bodies of the girls, but no trace of them has ever been found. One theory is that Mattias threw the girls, dead or alive, off the ferry that was heading to Propriano. Since their bodies have never been found, it's never been confirmed that Mattias killed them. Then in 2014, there was an odd twist in the case. A popular television show in Italy which focuses on missing people, called Chi l'ha visto, which translates to Who Has Seen, received a mysterious letter pertaining to the disappearance of Alessia and Livia. The writer didn't give his or her name, but they said they worked for a printer in Italy. The writer claimed that the printer had false documents made for the twins. The documents were then used to transport the twins to Canada. The twins were split up, and one was supposedly living in Ottawa, Ontario, and the other twin was living about 80 miles away in Lachute, Quebec. The producers of Chi l'ha visto turned the letter over to the Italian police, but the Italian police did not contact the police in Ottawa. The Ottawa police said without an official complaint, they could not start an investigation. So they have never investigated the claims made in the letter. The reporter from Chi l'ha visto said the show was going to hire a private investigator to look into the claims made in the letter. But if they did follow through and hire a private investigator, and if that private investigator found anything, is unknown. Irina hopes that Alessia and Livia are still alive. She doesn't think that Mattias would have taken out his rage for her on their daughters. After her daughters went missing, Irina stopped living in the home that she shared with Mattias and their daughters, but she couldn't bring herself to sell the house. She has not sought to have her daughters declared dead, and she is not sure if she'll ever be ready to do that. On October 7, 2011, which was the girl's 7th birthday, Irina launched Missing Children Switzerland. It is a foundation that has lobbied to get an Amber Alert type system implemented in Switzerland, and it helps educate the police on parental abductions. If Alessia and Livia are still alive, they would be 14 years old at the time of this video. Number 1. The Axeman of New Orleans. In 1919, 3 Maggio brothers and one of their wives lived in apartments behind a grocery store in New Orleans, Louisiana. Jake and Andrew Maggio lived in one apartment, and 58-year-old Joseph Maggio lived with his 51-year-old wife, Catherine, in the other apartment. They had all immigrated from Italy years earlier. The grocery store that they lived behind was run by Joseph and Catherine. On the night of May 22, 1918, Jake and Andrew went out drinking, and they returned home late. Sometime early in the morning, Jake was awoken by the sound of groaning in the apartment next door. He got Andrew up, and they went to investigate. They found a panel cut out of the door that led to the outside. They entered their brother and sister-in-law's apartment, and they were shocked by what they found. Catherine was dead. She had several deep cuts on her face and her chest, and her throat was slit. Joseph had severe head injuries. He was alive when his brothers found him, but he died before help arrived. In the bathtub, there was a bloody axe. The axe belonged to the deceased couple. In a neighbor's yard, the police found a straight razor. Andrew was a barber, and the razor belonged to him. He brought it home the evening before because he wanted to fix a nick in it. The police also found blood-stained clothes that were worn by the killer. The police believe that after attacking the couple, the killer changed into clean clothes. A doctor performed autopsies on both bodies. He believed that Catherine had gotten out of bed and she encountered her killer while she was standing. She was slashed 7 times with the razor, but she wasn't struck with the axe. Joseph was hit twice in the head with the axe, and his throat was also cut. The doctor thought that they had been attacked several hours before they were found. About a mile from the crime scene, the detectives found a message written in chalk on the sidewalk. There are different reports to exactly what the message read, but it was something to the effect of, "Mrs. Joseph Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." This message reminded the police, the newspapers, and the public of a murder that happened nearly 6 years to the day of the murder of the Maggios. Tony Sambra was a 27-year-old Italian grocer who lived and worked in New Orleans. He lived in an apartment behind the grocery store with his wife, Joanna. Many people who knew the couple called Joanna Mrs. Tony. In May 1912, Joanna was pregnant with the couple's second child. They had an 11-month-old son named Jake. At about 2 a.m. on May 16, 1912, a man entered Tony and Joanna's bedroom. The man fired 5 bullets into Tony and then calmly walked out of their home. Nothing was stolen, and the murder seemed motiveless. But that wasn't the only attack on Italian grocers in recent years in New Orleans. At about 3 a.m. on August 13, 1910, less than 2 years before Tony Sambra was shot to death, someone broke into the grocery store owned by August Caruti. August and his wife Harriet and their sons lived in an apartment behind the store. The intruder broke a window panel on the door, but then pried the door open. The intruder was armed with a meat cleaver that he stole from a butcher shop 6 blocks away from the family's home. The intruder walked into August and Harriet's bedroom and chopped August twice with a knife. Harriet woke up during the attack and saw a man standing beside their bed. He demanded money, so Harriet gave him some, and then he left the apartment. Once he was outside, he rolled and smoked a cigarette. Then he put on his shoes, and he walked off into the night. August was taken to the hospital, and despite being hit in the head and the chest with the meat cleaver, the wounds weren't too severe, and he survived. Harriet said that the attacker looked like he was in his mid-30s. He was 5'6" with broad shoulders. He had dark hair, a thick nose and thick lips, and he was clean-shaven. His voice was rough and husky. He was wearing black pants, a blue workman's shirt, and a black derby hat. Unfortunately, Harriet's description of the attacker did not lead to an arrest. A month after the attack, on the night of September 19, 1910, 42-year-old Joseph Rizzuto and his 36-year-old wife, Concetta, who were the children of Italian immigrants, went to bed in their apartment behind the grocery store which they own, in a rough neighborhood in New Orleans. In the early morning hours of September 20th, a man picked up a large butcher knife called a meat axe from a shed that was behind the grocery store. He got into the couple's apartment by climbing through an open window, and he found the couple sleeping in bed. First he started hacking Concetta, and then he attacked Joseph. The attacker then fled into the darkness of the night. Even though he had been hit twice in the face with a meat axe, Joseph was able to get out of bed and he fired his revolver twice into the air to alert his neighbors. His neighbors were awoken, and they called for help. Both Conchetta and Joseph were taken to the hospital, and amazingly, they survived the attack. They were horribly scarred, and Joseph lost vision in one of his eyes. Nearly 9 months later, the police were called to a grocery store that belonged to a newlywed couple named Joe and Mary Davi. Joe, who was 26, and Mary, who was 16, had immigrated from Italy when they were children. On the night of June 26, 1911, Mary, who was pregnant, was tired and she went to bed early. Joe went to bed at around 11 p.m. At 5 o'clock the next morning, a customer came to the store and found it locked. He knocked on the door of the couple's living quarters, and Mary answered the door. She seemed dazed and she had blood on her face. Sensing that something was deeply wrong, the customer got into the living quarters and he went to the couple's bedroom. Joe had suffered a severe head injury and his breathing was labored. He was taken to the hospital and he survived for 30 hours before passing away. Mary said that she woke up in the middle of the night and there was a man in the room. The man demanded money, and Mary said she didn't have any. The man then picked up a coffee mug and smashed it into the side of her head, knocking her unconscious. She said that she did not get a good look at the man. Even though the killer demanded money, he did not steal anything. The murder weapon wasn't found, but it's believed that it was a meat cleaver, just like the first two attacks. Then, exactly 11 months after Joe Davi was killed, Tony Scrimbaugh was shot to death in his bed. Then 6 years and 6 days after Tony's murder, Joseph and Catherine Maggio were killed in their home with an axe. Unfortunately, the Maggios were only the first victims in a new string of murders in New Orleans. On the morning of June 26, 1918, a delivery man arrived at the grocery store that belonged to Louis Bessemer. When he got to the store, he found it closed, and he thought that was very odd. He tried to open both the front door and the back door, and he found them both locked. He pounded on the door, and Bessemer came to the door. His face was covered in blood. Bessemer let the delivery man into the store, and the delivery man made his way to the apartment that was at the back of the store. In the bedroom, he found Bessemer's live-in girlfriend, Harriet Lowe. Like Bessemer, she was bleeding from the head. She was barely conscious. The delivery man found help, and Bessemer and Lowe were transported to the hospital. Close to the bed, the police found a bloody axe handle and a rusty axe head. The axe, which belonged to Bessemer, had been broken in the attack. Bessemer had only suffered minor wounds, and he was released from the hospital after 6 days. Lowe's wounds were much more severe, and for several weeks, she was in and out of consciousness. After a few weeks, it looked like she would survive, but she was disfigured and her face was paralyzed. The police searched Bessemer's home, and they found letters written in Yiddish, German, and Russian. The letters led the police to suspect that Bessemer was a German spy. When Lowe started to stay conscious for longer periods of time, the police asked her if Bessemer was a spy, and she said yes. So Bessemer was arrested. The problem was that Lowe was delusional a lot of the time. After a short investigation, the police concluded that Bessemer was not a spy, and he was released 2 days after he was arrested. 2 months after the attack, Lowe underwent surgery that was supposed to repair her paralyzed face. On August 3, 1918, 2 days after the surgery, her health took a turn for the worst, and she died. On her deathbed, she supposedly accused Bessemer of attacking her. Besides thinking he was a spy, the police thought that Bessemer could have been the person who attacked Lowe. They thought this because his wounds were much less severe than Lowe's injuries. So he may have injured himself to make it look like they were both attacked. Also, when the delivery man came to the grocery store, he found all the doors locked. There were also no signs of a break-in. The police thought that the logical explanation was that someone inside the home committed the attack. Specifically, Bessemer may have staged the attack to make it look like the work of the Axeman. The attack on Bessemer and Lowe were different from previous attacks in two significant ways. The first is that the earlier attacks happened in the apartments behind grocery stores in sparsely populated areas, while Bessemer's grocery store was in a densely populated area. Secondly, all the other victims were Italian or of Italian descent. Bessemer was Polish, and Lowe wasn't Italian either. Not long after Lowe's death, Bessemer was arrested and charged with her murder. On the night of August 5, 1918, hours after Harriet Lowe passed away, 28-year-old Anna Schneider put her 3 children to bed in the home that she shared with her husband in New Orleans. Schneider, who was 8 months pregnant, then got into bed herself. Her husband worked the night shift at the South Pacific Wharf, so he wasn't home that night. At 2 a.m., Schneider's sister, who lived next door, heard a scream coming from Schneider's apartment. Her sister's husband went to check on Schneider, and he found her bleeding from the head. She was conscious, and she said she didn't know what happened to her. Not long after her brother-in-law found her, Schneider lost consciousness. 2 days later, she was alive, but she was slipping in and out of consciousness. That's when she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Schneider fully regained consciousness not long after the baby was delivered. She said she only had fleeting memories of the birth. The police weren't sure if the attack was related to the Axeman murders because it was quite different than the other attacks. Schneider, who was not Italian, was alone when she was assaulted. The Axeman had just never attacked a single woman. He usually got into the bedrooms of couples, and the man was usually the target. Also, Schneider wasn't attacked with an axe. Instead, she was bashed in the head with a bedside lamp. There was money missing from Schneider's husband's wallet, but the attacker had missed a tin with $100 in it. So it was thought that Schneider was attacked by a robber who became startled when she woke up. He grabbed the closest object he could use as a weapon, which was the bedside lamp, and he hit her in the face with it. He then ran away instead of ensuring that she was dead. Schneider was released from the hospital after a few weeks. 8-year-old Joseph Romano lived with his 2 adult nieces behind a grocery store that was run by another one of his nieces. Even though Romano was an elderly man, he worked as a barber. 5 nights after Schneider was attacked, on August 10, 1918, at about 3 a.m., one of his nieces heard a commotion coming from his room, and then she heard groaning. She went into the room, and she found her uncle bleeding from a large head wound. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died shortly after arriving. The doctors had time to ask him if he knew who attacked him, and he said he didn't see the attacker. Romano had been killed with a single blow to the head with an axe. The axe was found beside his bed. After that, The Axeman went quiet for the rest of 1918. On March 10, 1919, 7 months after the last murder, the neighbors of the Cortimiglia family, who lived in New Orleans, heard screams coming from their house. The Cortimiglia family consisted of Charles, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary. Charles had immigrated from Italy, and Rosie was born in Louisiana. Two of the first people to reach the family's home was Orlando Giordano, an elderly grocer, and his 18-year-old son, Frank. They found the family in bed. Rosie was holding Mary in her arms. They had all been hit with an axe. Charles and Rosie were rushed to the hospital, but it was too late for their daughter Mary. Sadly, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Against all odds, Charles and Rosie survived the attack. The police interviewed them, and Rosie said that Orlando and Frank Giordano attacked them. But there were several problems with Rosie's accusation. For example, Orlando was too old and feeble to have attacked the family. Also, a panel on the door was missing, and it's believed that the attacker climbed through the hole left by the missing panel. Frank was a large 18-year-old man, and he would not have been able to fit through the door panel. Also, Charles said that he had never seen his attacker before, and he knew Orlando and Frank quite well. In fact, the Giordanos and the Cortimiglia family were in the middle of a dispute when the family was attacked. The police investigated the Giordanos, but they had a problem tying them to the attack. On March 14th, 4 days after the family was attacked, the newspaper, the Times-Picayune, received a neatly handwritten letter from someone claiming to be the Axeman. 2 days later, the newspaper decided to publish the letter. It reads, Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need for such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wish, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee, I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fantasy. And then the letter was signed off, the Axeman. Some people were terrified by the letter, and parties were thrown on the night indicated in the letter to keep the Axeman away. Other people did not think that the letter was from the Axeman. They thought the Axeman was a working class man, and the writing in the letter was too sophisticated for a working class man. Instead, they thought the letter was probably written by a local musician and businessman. After the letter was published, he debuted a new song called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa. Whether the letter was really from the Axeman or not, there were no axe murders on the Tuesday night indicated in the letter. 2 months after the attack on the Cormiglia family, Orlando and Frank Giordano were indicted for the murder of 2-year-old Mary Cormiglia. On May 26, 1919, about 3 weeks after they were indicted, both father and son were found guilty. Orlando was sentenced to life in prison, and Frank was sentenced to death. Meanwhile, Louis Bessemer continued to sit in prison while he awaited trial for the murder of his mistress, Harriet Lowe. In June 1919, 9 months after Harriet died, Bessemer went to trial. He was ultimately acquitted of all charges. At 3:30 on the morning of August 3, 1919, 19-year-old Sarah Lawman awoke to find a man standing over her bed. She screamed, and the man ran out of her house. Her parents came into her room, and they thought she was unharmed. But then later, she complained about pain in her head. Her mother examined her, and she found a small cut behind her ear. The police were called, and when they arrived at the family's home, they asked to see their axe. When her father went to retrieve it, he found it missing. Later that day, it was found a few blocks away from the family's home. When Lawman was examined by a doctor, he said that the injury behind her ear wasn't caused by an axe. Instead, she was injured by a round, blunt instrument. But what that weapon was is unknown to this day. It's also a mystery as to why the intruders stole the family's axe. Mike and Esther Pipitone owned a grocery store in New Orleans, and they lived behind the store. The last weekend of October 1919 was a busy one for the couple. A block away from their store, there was a circus, and many people stopped into the store to buy drinks and snacks. When they retired to their bed on the night of October 27th, they were exhausted. Hours later, at about 1:40 a.m., their daughter ran out into the street, screaming and looking for help. She found a police officer patrolling the streets, and she led him back to her home. Her 35-year-old father, Mike, was bleeding badly from a wound in his head. Hours later, he was pronounced dead. He had been hit 3 times in the head with an axe. Mike's wife Esther, who was unharmed, was interviewed by the police. She said she woke up and she saw 2 intruders. One was tall and skinny, and the other one was short with broad shoulders. For this reason, the police weren't sure if Mike was a victim of the Axeman. All the other surviving victims said they were attacked by one man. There was also a possible motive for Mike's murder, unlike the other murders, which just seemed random or possibly racially motivated. 9 years earlier, Mike's father had killed a member of the mafia known as the Black Hand. So it was thought that Mike was killed in retaliation. The police thought it was possible that the attacks were part of a racketeering scheme, or they were committed to intimidate the Italian community in New Orleans. One thing that was determined was that Orlando and Frank Giordano weren't involved in the attacks. In May 1919, they were convicted of killing 2-year-old Mary Cormiglia. In December 1920, they were released from prison because Mary's mother, Rosie, recanted her accusations. After Mike Pipitone's murder in October 1919, the axe attacks in New Orleans came to an end. Then just over 2 years after his murder, in December 1921, a suspect in the Axeman attacks emerged, and he had a connection to the Black Hand. It all started in the wake of Mike Pipitone's murder. Mike's widow, Esther, was having problems supporting her 6 children, who were all under the age of 12. She ended up having some of her children move in with other family members, and she put other ones up for adoption. In January 1921, Esther traveled to Los Angeles, California to attend the wedding of her niece, Rosa. Rosa was the daughter of Esther's late sister, Jenny. Jenny had died in the 1918 flu epidemic. At the wedding, Esther became reacquainted with Jenny's widower, Angelo Albano. After Jenny died, Angelo had moved from New Orleans to Los Angeles, where he set up and ran a successful grocery store. Jenny was in her early 30s, and Angelo was twice her age, but that didn't stop them from getting married in September 1921. Just 8 weeks later, on October 27th, Angelo walked out the door to go to the market, and he didn't return. Esther reported him missing. In the weeks after he disappeared, Esther tried her best to continue on with her life. This included caring for Angelo's elderly father. At around noon on December 5th, 1921, just over a month after Angelo disappeared, a man walked into Esther's house. The man spoke with a thick Italian accent, and he had scars on his face. Esther recognized him from New Orleans. His name was Joseph Mumphrey, and he was a member of the Black Hand. Mumphrey demanded $500 from Esther. She told him that she didn't have that type of money. He told her that if she didn't get him the money, then he would kill her, just like he had killed Angelo. Then he hinted that he had a gun in the pocket of his pants. Esther told Mumphrey to wait, and then she went into another room. When Esther came back into the room where Mumphrey was standing, she started shooting at him with a revolver. She missed with her first shot, but her second one was a hit. Mumphrey got out of the house and tried to pull out his gun, but it became tangled in his jacket. He fell down the front steps as Esther kept shooting him. When Esther ran out of bullets, she dropped the revolver and then went back inside. She came back outside moments later with a second revolver and pumped 6 more bullets into Mumphrey. After the shooting, Esther's niece ran and got a police officer, and Esther was arrested. The police charged her with murder because they didn't think the shooting was self-defense, because Mumphrey had been shot 11 times, including 3 times in the back. Esther went to trial in April 1922. Her lawyer told the court that Mumphrey was a gangster who had served time for attempted murder. He was also a suspect in the murder of several people, including both of Esther's husbands. It turned out that when Esther's second husband, Angelo, moved from New Orleans to Los Angeles, he had been partners with Mumphrey, but then Angelo dissolved the business relationship. The jury quickly found Esther not guilty. The body of Angelo Albano has never been found. After Mumphrey was killed, the police and the newspapers in New Orleans identified him as a suspect in the axe murders. But modern-day investigators do not think that he was the Axeman. Notably, Mumphrey was either in prison or he wasn't in New Orleans when several of the murders were committed. These investigators also don't think that the attacks were committed by the Mafia. Usually, members of the Mafia don't attack women and children. Also, the primary motivation behind many of the Mafia's crimes is financial gain, and not much was stolen from any of the living quarters or the grocery stores. Investigators aren't even convinced that all 11 attacks were connected. Two major outliers are Anna Schneider and Sarah Lawman. The Axeman usually attacked couples, and the man seemed to be the focus of the attack. In most cases, the men were Italian or of Italian descent, and they lived in the apartment attached to the grocery store which they ran. Schneider and Lawman were attacked, but not killed, while they were alone in bed. Also, neither were Italian, nor were they married to Italian men, and they were not associated with the grocery business. And neither woman was attacked with an axe. However, since the Axeman was never caught, it's hard to know what attacks he committed and which he didn't. Besides Mumphrey, another suspect in the New Orleans axe slayings is a serial killer who was never caught, called the Southern Pacific Axeman. The Southern Pacific Axeman is suspected of killing around 52 people in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi between November 1909 and November 1912. Just like the Axeman of New Orleans, the Southern Pacific Axeman attacked people in the middle of the night while they were sleeping in bed. Nearly all the murders happened along the Southern Pacific Railway. New Orleans is also a stop on the railway. Also, the timelines don't conflict with each other. The first Southern Pacific Axeman murder happened in November 1909 in Rayne, Louisiana. 10 months later, in August 1910, the first suspected New Orleans Axeman attack happened. A month later, there was another attack in New Orleans. About 4 months after that, in January 1911, an attack associated with the Southern Pacific Axeman happened in Crowley, Louisiana. This was followed by another Southern Pacific Axeman attack in February 1911 in Lafayette, Louisiana. A month after that, the Southern Pacific Axeman struck again. This attack happened in San Antonio, Texas, which is also on the Southern Pacific Railway. 5 months later, Joe Davey was killed in his bed in New Orleans. In November 1911, another family in Lafayette was attacked with an axe. On the night of January 19, 1912, a family in Crowley, Louisiana was attacked, and then 2 days later, there was another attack over 50 miles away in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Both massacres are attributed to the Southern Pacific Axeman. A month later, there was an attack in Beaumont, Texas. This was followed by an axe attack in Gildan, Texas on March 27, 1912. Just a few weeks later, on April 9th, a family in San Antonio was killed with an axe. A month after that, Tony Seinbrough was shot to death in his bed in New Orleans. Tony was the only victim to be shot. His murder is considered linked to the New Orleans Axeman murders because he was an Italian grocer and because of the message that was written on the sidewalk near the Maggio's crime scene that seemingly referenced his wife. After Seinbrough's murder, the killings in New Orleans came to a stop, but the attacks on families who lived near the Southern Pacific Railway continued. On August 16, 1912, there was an attack on a family in San Antonio. Finally, there was a family killed with an axe in Philadelphia, Mississippi on November 12, 1912. Then the Southern Pacific Axeman went quiet. 5.5 years later, the Axeman of New Orleans murders began with the axe slayings of Joseph and Catherine Maggio. There were several significant differences between the two strings of Axeman killings. The first is that the target of many of the New Orleans attacks seemed to be the man living in the home, whereas the Southern Pacific Axeman wiped out or tried to wipe out entire families. Some houses he targeted didn't have a man living in them, and single mothers and their children were the ones who were attacked. Also, none of the victims were Italian. If there was a man living in the house, he was either black or mulatto. In a few cases, the matriarchs were white, but none of them were Italian or of Italian descent. Besides the differences in victims' profiles, some people don't believe that the Southern Pacific Axeman and the New Orleans Axeman are the same person because of the gap in time between the murders. The first Southern Pacific Axeman attacks took place in November 1909, and then the majority happened between January 1911 and November 1912. There were 4 attacks in New Orleans that happened around the same time. One occurred in August 1910, another one happened a month later in September 1910. These were followed by a murder in June 1911, and the 4th one happened in May 1912. But most of the attacks in New Orleans occurred between May 1918 and October 1919. That is a gap of 5.5 years between the Southern Pacific Axe murders and the latter New Orleans Axe murders. But it's important to point out that it's unclear if the first 4 attacks that happened in New Orleans between 1910 and 1912 are connected to the latter Axeman murders that started in May 1918, 6 years after the original string of murders. The 4 earlier attacks in New Orleans were different from both strings of Axeman attacks because none of the victims were attacked with an axe. The first 3 attacks were probably committed with butcher knives, while the May 19th victim was shot. So while there are similarities between the strings of murders, there are also a lot of differences. So this makes it difficult to know if one killer was responsible for all the killings, or if it was the work of several killers. It may be possible that one killer is responsible for the murders in New Orleans that happened between 1909 and 1912, and then another killer was responsible for the Southern Pacific Axe murders, then a third killer was responsible for the axe murders in New Orleans that happened between 1918 and 1919. It's also possible that there were more than 3 killers. Unfortunately, since all the murders happened over a century ago, we will probably never know who the Axeman of New Orleans was and how many victims he truly claimed. For more information on the Southern Pacific Axeman, please watch our video 3 Unsolved Mysteries with Strange Written Clues Part 4, which we'll link to in the next few seconds. Number 3. Janet Rash. Janet Rash was born in the small city of Merrill, Wisconsin in July 1964. She grew up there, and after graduating from high school, she attended the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, which is about 50 miles from Merrill. She was majoring in business. To help pay for school, Rash worked at a dining center on campus. On the second weekend of October 1984, Rash, who was 20, was supposed to work at the dining center. But she wanted to go home that weekend, so she changed her shift. On the morning of October 11th, she left her dorm room with a duffel bag, and she started hitchhiking near the campus. A friend picked her up and dropped her off at an intersection about 12 miles from the campus. But Rash never made it to Merrill. When she didn't come home, her father reported her missing. For a month, Rash's friends and family had no idea what happened to her. Then, on November 17, 1984, a group of hunters were in some woods in the town of Buena Vista, Wisconsin, about 2 miles from the intersection where Rash had been dropped off. They were about 300 yards from the road when they found Janet Rash's partially clad remains. Because of the state of decomposition, the medical examiner was not able to determine much about her death. His best guess was that she had been strangled to death. But other than that, not much was learned from the autopsy. Unfortunately, even though the police had several persons of interest, no arrests were made in the days, weeks, or even years after the murder. In 2002, 18 years after the murder, the police received a tip that Rash may have been pregnant when she was killed. So in June 2002, the police had her body exhumed. Besides checking to see if she was pregnant, they also looked for other forensic evidence that may have been left behind, like the killer's DNA. The police did not make the findings from the exhumation public. Also, the exhumation did not lead to an arrest. 11 years later, and 29 years after the murder, the newspaper, the Stevens Point Journal, did a story about Rash's death. Then, about a month after the story was published, the police received an anonymous letter. At first, the police did not go public about the existence of the letter. Then about 10 months later, they announced that they were looking for the author. The police have never made the contents of the letter public. The Rash family doesn't even know what's written in the letter. The only thing the police have said about the letter is that the author knows details about the murder that have never been made public. Unfortunately, at the time of this video, it's been nearly 6 years since the police received the letter, and the identity of the author is still a mystery. The police are still hoping that they can talk to the writer because they think that he or she can be vital to solving Rash's murder. The police do not consider the murder of Janet Rash to be a cold case. They said they still have several persons of interest. The identities of those people and how many persons of interest they have has never been made public. After 35 years without an arrest, Janet Rash's friends, family, and the police are hoping that her case will be solved soon. They are hoping that the letter writer truly knows something about her murder, that he or she will come forward and give everyone some closure. Number 2. June Robles. In the mid-1930s, Tucson, Arizona was just a small city with a population of about 35,000 people. It was a quiet city, and parents felt safe letting their children walk to and from school without adult supervision. Just after 3 o'clock on the afternoon of April 25, 1934, 6-year-old June Robles was walking from her school to her aunt's house. June was the daughter of Fernando and Helen Robles. Fernando had previously worked as a railway clerk, and then he opened his own electrical supply store. Fernando's father, Burnaby Robles, was one of the richest men in Tucson. He was a cattle baron who owned a lot of property in and around Tucson. As June was walking to her aunt's home, a man in a dirty and beat-up Ford sedan pulled up behind her. He was wearing glasses, and he was described as dirty and scrawny. He told June that she needed to go with him to her father's electrical supply store. At first, June did not want to go with the man, but he convinced her to get into his car. Once June was in the car, he sped off. At 5 p.m. that same day, a young man walked into June's father's electrical supply store. The boy found June's father, Fernando, and told him that he had been paid 25 cents to bring him a note. The note said that June had been kidnapped, but she was safe. The note went on to say that she would be released if Fernando paid $15,000, which is about $286,000 in 2019. The note gave complex directions on how Fernando should hand over the money. He had to make stops all over the Tucson area. In order to make all the stops, Fernando would have to drive all night. The author wrote that they would be watching to make sure he made all the stops. For the last part of the route, Fernando would have to drive down a desert road. He was supposed to look out for a white handkerchief. When he saw the handkerchief, he was to toss the money out the window. He was told not to dim his lights, slow down, or stop. Then 48 hours after they got the money, June would be returned to him, alive and well. The letter writer said that there would be more correspondence, and they would know that the letters were from him because he would use the word obey. The letter was then signed off XYZ, and then, in all caps, it said, obey. Fernando wrote a response and gave it to the boy. The boy went back to the parking lot to give the man the response, but he was gone. At first, Fernando did not want to get the police involved. But somehow, the police became aware of the kidnapping, and they went to Fernando and Helen's house to help. They also launched a massive search around the city for June. Volunteers who were looking for vigilante justice also searched for June, but no trace of June was found. The next day, June's grandfather, the wealthy cattle baron and real estate mogul, Burnaby, received a ransom letter. It reads, Mr. Robles, child safe. We are willing to reduce the ransom to $10,000 if you act quickly. Child will be returned safely as per your instructions. Obey instructions. The letter was signed off with the letter Z. After the second letter was received, June's father, Fernando, tried to make contact with the kidnappers by writing a letter and having it published in several newspapers. The letter contained 4 questions that only June would have known the answers to. Several newspapers published the letter, but there was no immediate response from the kidnappers. On May 7th, 12 days after June was kidnapped, a note was shoved under the door of the county attorney's office, which was located in the Pima County Courthouse. A custodian found the note and he brought it to the sheriff's office. It was a note from the kidnappers. Supposedly, the kidnappers gave answers to Fernando's questions, but it's unclear if they were the correct answers. The note told Fernando to follow the instructions in the earlier letter and toss the money out into the desert. The author closed out the letter by writing, "Now or never." Once again, it was signed XYZ, and below that, in all caps, was the word obey. Fernando did as he was instructed. For several nights, he followed the route and tossed the money out of his car in the specified area. But no one ever picked up the money. After receiving the third letter, Fernando tried to get in contact with the kidnappers again, but they went quiet. Then on May 14th, 19 days after June was kidnapped, and a week after the note was shoved under the door of the county attorney's office, the governor of Arizona received a postcard that was sent from Chicago, Illinois, via airmail. The postcard indicated that June's body was buried in the desert about 9 miles from downtown Tucson. Fernando's twin brother, Carlos Robles, worked for the county attorney, Clarence Houston. Carlos and Houston followed the directions on the postcard and spent 3 hours searching the desert. Then Houston came across a loose mound of dirt. Sagebrush, mesquite, and cholla cactus had been placed on top of the mound of dirt. Houston started digging, and then he hit something hard. It was a piece of perforated sheet metal. He lifted the sheet metal, and beneath it was a coffin-like cage. Houston was sure he would find June's dead body in there. But much to his surprise, June was alive and conscious. Houston asked June if she recognized him and if she was afraid of him. She said she wasn't afraid of him, she just wanted to see her mother. Houston and Carlos got her out of the cage and rushed her to the hospital. All things considered, June was in good condition. She was very dirty, she had ant bites all over her body, she was blistered from the heat, and her ankle was chafed because a chain had been wrapped around her ankle. June's only concern was that they left her report card in the cage. She wanted to show her report card to her mother. June supposedly had been in the cage buried in the desert for the entire 19 days of her captivity. She lived off snacks like graham crackers, potato chips, and fruit that her kidnappers left for her. She used a ceramic pot for her toilet. During her captivity, her kidnappers had only checked on her 4 times. As to the identities of the kidnappers, that is a mystery. It's not even clear how many people were involved in the kidnapping. Only one arrest was ever made. It was a 31-year-old Tucson dance hall operator named Oscar Buster Robson. Authorities thought that his handwriting resembled the handwriting in the letters. Robson was investigated and questioned for months, but no evidence was found that connected him to the kidnapping, so the charges against him were dropped. In May 1935, about a year after the kidnapping, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the Department of Justice, said that investigators had learned information about the kidnappers from a man who was on his deathbed. Supposedly, the dying man and his associates were people of interest in the case. The man apparently gave the name of 3 kidnappers and then died in the hospital not long afterward. As a result, Hoover said he considered the case solved. But the police in Tucson were doubtful of Hoover's assertion. The man who supposedly gave the deathbed confession was never publicly identified. Neither were the 3 people he named. Also, no arrests were made in the wake of the deathbed confession. In December 1936, about 2.5 years after the kidnapping, all the evidence in the case was presented to the grand jury. The grand jury decided that there was not enough evidence to charge anyone with any crime. When the jury concluded that, the investigation into the kidnapping came to an end. After June was rescued, she stayed out of the public eye. In 1950, she got married. Her wedding announcement which was published in the newspaper, made no mention of her kidnapping. She went on to have 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. June Robles died at the age of 87 on September 2, 2014, in Tucson. Even today, there are many unanswered questions regarding the case. Notably, who kidnapped June? Did she really spend 19 days in the cage buried in the desert? Could she have even survived 19 days in the cage? Who was the dying man who confessed on his deathbed? Who did he name as the kidnappers? Unfortunately, these questions will most likely never be answered. Number 1. Carla Walker. On the night of February 16, 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, attended a Valentine's dance at their high school in Fort Worth, Texas. After the dance, they stopped off at a popular bowling alley to use the washroom. At about 1 a.m., Carla and Rodney were sitting in Rodney's car in the parking lot of the bowling alley. Then suddenly, a man wearing a cowboy hat pulled open the passenger side door, which Carla was leaning against. He then started to pull Carla out of the car. Rodney tried to pull her back towards him. The man was armed with a revolver, and he started pistol whipping Rodney in the head. After several blows, Rodney lost consciousness. When he came to, Carla was gone. Rodney reported the kidnapping to the police, and an extensive search was conducted. 3 days later, 2 police officers were searching an area around Benbrook Lake. They found the partially nude body of Carla Walker. The medical examiner determined that Carla had been kept alive for 2 days before she was strangled to death. During those 2 days, she was sexually assaulted and tortured. She was also injected with morphine. Unfortunately, the police didn't make any arrests in the wake of the murder. Their first suspect was Carla's boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. But he was given a polygraph exam and he passed, so he was cleared as a suspect. Another suspect emerged a few months later in April. On April 23, 1974, 16-year-old Danita Cash, who lived in Arlington, Texas, drove her family's car to a wooded area near the Trinity River. Danita's brother was doing some fishing, and she was there to pick him up. She honked her horn to alert her brother that she was there, but her brother ignored her. Instead, a man approached her car and asked her if she needed help. She said she didn't, and the man walked away. Then Danita honked her horn again. The man returned to her car, and this time, he was holding a sawed-off shotgun. He forced her to get out of her car, and then he made her walk to his pickup truck. When she got inside the cab of the truck, he put tape over her mouth and around her wrists. He then started driving into the woods. Then Danita made motions to indicate that the tape was making it difficult for her to breathe. The man removed the tape that was covering her mouth, but when he did so, he drove off the road. His truck then got stuck in the mud. He tried to get his truck moving again, but he couldn't. Danita then pleaded with him to let her go. She pointed at a cross necklace that she was wearing and told him to look at it. The man agreed to let her go, but he vowed to kill her if she went to the police. Danita ran back to her car and drove straight home. She told her mother what happened, and her mother called the police. The police went to the area where the man's truck got stuck, but he was gone. Danita was able to describe the man and his pickup truck, which she said was unique. It was a 1957 blue and white pickup that was equipped with a distinctive toolbox. The police examined the tape that was used to bind Danita. They noted that the tape was sticky on both sides. They thought it was the type of tape that was used by carpet layers. Also, on the ground in the area where the truck became stuck, the police found a sanding disc. The police thought the man used the sanding disc to get traction to get his truck out of the mud. The sanding disc was commonly used by carpet layers to sand floors. The police then made an appeal to the public. They were looking for a man who worked as a carpet layer and drove a blue and white 1957 pickup truck. A few days later, a man living in Euless, Texas called the police and told them that his neighbor was a carpet layer with a truck that was similar to the one described by Danita. The man had recently talked about painting his truck. The neighbor's name was Tommy Ray Nealand. The police went to Nealand's house and secretly took a photograph of him. Danita was shown a photo lineup which included a photograph of Nealand. She immediately identified Nealand as the man who kidnapped her. The police got a search warrant for Nealand's home and he was arrested. To some people, his arrest was a surprise. Nealand was heavily involved with his church. He taught Sunday school and he drove the church bus. He was rarely seen without his Bible. But to other people, his arrest wasn't very surprising. It turned out that Nealand had been the prime suspect in another murder. Before Nealand moved to Euless, he lived in Kermit, Texas. About 3.5 years earlier, in September 1970, Nancy and Gene Mitchell and their son and daughter lived across the road from Nealand, his wife, and their 2 children. On the night of September 15th, Gene was working late. Nancy, who was 27, was at home with the children. Gene got home around 12:45 a.m. and he found Nancy missing. The kids were asleep in their beds and Nancy's car was in the garage, but Nancy was nowhere to be found. A few hours later, Gene reported her missing. The Mitchells lived on a quiet street. The Mitchells' neighbors were interviewed, and they were asked if they saw anyone near their home on the night that Nancy went missing. One neighbor said that they saw Tommy Ray Nealand drive out of the neighborhood that evening. Nealand was then interviewed by the police. Nealand said that his wife and kids were away that night, and he was bored, so he went to work. At the time, he was working as an auto mechanic. However, no one could verify his story, so he was asked to take a polygraph exam. Nealand agreed, but the results of the exam were inconclusive. Then, 2 days after Nancy Mitchell went missing, pieces of her clothing were found along the highway just outside of Kermit. It looked like her clothes had been cut with a pair of scissors. 9 months later, some skeletal remains were found on some oil land about a mile from where Nancy's clothes were found. The remains were determined to be 27-year-old Nancy Mitchell. The area where her remains were found had been searched 9 months earlier, but nothing had been found. The remains were found in a sand pit, and it's believed that the remains were buried there, and in the 9 months, the sand blew away, exposing the remains. It turned out that the property where the remains were found belonged to Nealon's father. After Nancy's remains were found, Nealon agreed to take another polygraph exam, but once again, the results were inconclusive. Not long after Nancy went missing, Nealon and his family moved to Euless. After Nealon was arrested for the kidnapping of Danita Cash, he was placed in a lineup. Danita picked him as the man who kidnapped her. Carla Walker's boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, also came to the police station to look at a lineup. He identified Nealon as the man who attacked them and kidnapped Carla. After the lineups, Nealon decided that he wanted to confess. He said that on the night Nancy Mitchell went missing, he knew that her husband, Gene, was working late. He walked over to their home and knocked on their door. When Nancy opened the door, he pointed a gun at her. He then led her to his home. He sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and then sexually assaulted her again. He then loaded her body into his pickup truck, drove out to his father's land, and buried her body in the sandpit. Nealon then made a shocking admission to the police. He confessed to a crime that the police had no idea he was connected to. The crime happened about 2 years after Nancy Mitchell was killed. On June 30th, 1972, 17-year-old Jane Handy and 15-year-old Robert Golson left their home in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to go to Dallas, Texas for a concert. On the way, their car broke down and they started hitchhiking. Nealon said that he picked up the young couple near Gainesville, Texas. He took them to a secluded area near Fort Worth and he bound their wrists with coat hangers. He then sexually assaulted Jane. He stabbed both Jane and Robert a dozen times in the torso and slashed their throats. He also stabbed Jane in the face multiple times to the point where she was unrecognizable. Their bodies were found the next day. Nealon claimed that he did not kidnap or kill Carla Walker. Nealon made a plea deal with the district attorney. For kidnapping Danita Cash, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. For the murders of Jane Handy and Robert Golson, he was given life sentences. For the murder of Nancy Mitchell, he was sentenced to 550 years in prison. Amazingly, because of overcrowding in the Texas prison system, Nealon was paroled in 1987 after only serving 13 years. Then in July 1994, about 7 years after he was paroled, 2 rifles were found in his truck. This was a violation of his parole, and he was sent back to prison. He has remained incarcerated ever since. Even though Rodney McCoy identified Nealon as the man who kidnapped Carla Walker, he was never charged with her kidnapping or murder because he did not confess to it. Today, the police are not convinced that Nealon killed her. In fact, in 1978, another man was indicted for her murder. In February 1978, Jimmy Dean Sasser confessed to the murder. However, the charges were dropped 8 months later when he recanted. Sasser claimed he was drunk and high when he confessed. Since then, the case has remained cold. Then in the spring of 2019, 45 years after Carla was murdered, the police released a letter that was sent to them shortly after Carla was killed. The letter is addressed to Detective Lieutenant Oliver Ball. The writer gives a name and then says that person killed Carla Walker in Benbrook. The name was redacted by the police because the person was never linked to the crime. It then says sign 10100, and there is a postscript which reads, "It is hard to say, but it is true." And once again, the author wrote sign 10100. The police are not sure what sign 10100 means, but they think it's possibly related to the police code for a dead body. The police think that the author of the letter may know something that could give them a break in the case. They are hoping that person will come forward and talk to them. Or they are hoping that someone will recognize the handwriting and help them identify the author of the letter. Carla Walker's friends and family are hoping for the same thing. After 45 years, they want the case to be closed, and if possible, for justice to be served. Number 3. Findlay Smith. In October 2012, Findlay Smith was a 38-year-old mother of 4 living in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, New York. 2 of her older children were in their 20s and in college. The other 2 were teenagers and didn't live with her. She was an unemployed health worker who lived alone. She was an active member of the New Dimension Seventh-day Adventist Church, where she attended services every Saturday. She had been a member of the church for about 3 years. A fellow churchgoer told the New York Times that Findlay would tell people about the Lord when she met them. Findlay was also 8 months pregnant with her 5th child. She was engaged to a 28-year-old man named Anthony Jackman. Unfortunately, the day before the wedding, tragedy struck. On October 20th, 2012, Findlay's landlord found her lifeless body face down in her apartment. The 38-year-old had been stabbed in the neck and her throat had been slashed. Sadly, the baby she was carrying also died. She was about 2 weeks from delivery. It was unclear if Jackman was the father. A crowd of about 100 people, many from the church community, held a vigil outside of Findlay's home for her most of the day. They watched as Findlay's body was wheeled out of her apartment. The police found no evidence of forced entry, nor did they retrieve a murder weapon, so they suspected that Findlay may have known her killer. In an odd twist, the police found a strange note stuffed under her body. The note reads, "I will kill 1 pregnant woman a month starting now until Lead Boy Malvo is set free." Lead Boy Malvo is one member of a pair of killers known as the DC Snipers. In 2002, 17-year-old Malvo and 41-year-old John Allen Muhammad shot at least 13 people at random with a sniper rifle. 10 people were killed and 3 were injured. Malvo testified in court that the second phase of their crime spree was to shoot a pregnant woman in the stomach. Malvo was sentenced to life in prison in 2004, while Muhammad was executed in November 2009. The police said that the note found under Findlay's body was printed off a computer in block letters. The note was signed "The Apprentice" and it had a little smiley face. The police suspected that the note was a ruse to throw them off the killer's trail. The police immediately set their sights on Findlay's fiancé, Anthony Jackman. Findlay's friends knew very little about Jackman. To them, he was quiet, and they knew he worked in construction. When the police investigated Jackman, they discovered he was already married to a woman in New Jersey. However, he was estranged from his wife, and he lived with his parents in the same neighborhood as Findlay. Shortly after the murder, the police arrested Jackman, but wasn't for the murder. Instead, he was charged with possession of forging license plates. This was the 15th time he was arrested for crimes such as larceny and weapons possession, dating back to 1999. Jackman was released the next day. He was never charged with the murder of Findlay Smith. Findlay also feuded with a neighbor before the murder. In this incident, the neighbor was angry because he thought that Vindley had let his dog out of the building. He had threatened to kill Vindley. It's unclear if this person was ever questioned by the police. Vindley also had a history of evictions. She got into a nasty fight with her sister before being forced out of an apartment months before the murder in March 2012. The neighbor remembered the sister yelling, "You're messing with a married man. You don't know who the baby daddy is. You're choosing your boyfriend over your kids. You're so worried about this man, and you're not worried about your kids. I'm sick of you getting kicked out of places." A bloody fingerprint was found on the note that was stuffed under the body, but none of the results of the fingerprinting or the blood work were made public. More than 10 years after the murder of Vindley Smith, the police have not publicly released any more information, and the case remains unsolved. Number 2. Gillian Fuller. 26-year-old Gillian Fuller lived a life that some people called complicated. She was described as athletic, intelligent, and outgoing. She loved spending time with her family and friends. Her father, George Fuller, was a lawyer, and her mother was a psychiatrist, Dr. Lois Fuller. Gillian was an accomplished athlete. She was ranked 23rd in Canada for outdoor speed skating, and she was a competitive runner. Her talents went beyond athletics. Gillian was fluent in French and considered an expert pianist. She loved music and books. However, Gillian was reported to be a loner that lived on government assistance. At one point, she was treated for alcoholism. Gillian was known to associate with questionable characters when drinking at Vancouver's Fraser Arms Hotel, a bar with wild clientele. Her father, George Fuller, even told media outlets that Gillian had been assaulted twice by people she knew from the bar. George criticized the police for bringing Gillian home instead of the hospital after one such occasion. George also said that Gillian was engaged to a man with a lengthy criminal record. Early on the morning of March 4, 1993, a newspaper delivery person called 911 after they noticed an apartment was on fire. Firefighters arrived at around 4 a.m. and put out the fire. They found the body of 28-year-old Gillian Fuller on her bed. The cause of death was not given other than that she had died from a vicious assault. The fire department suspected that the fire was started to cover up the murder. There were no signs of forced entry at Gillian's apartment, so the police suspected that she knew her murderer. The police would not reveal if she had been sexually assaulted or not. However, neighbors reported that Gillian's body was found stripped and they saw blood in her apartment. Gillian lived alone at the time. The police traced Gillian's last steps. She was seen reading a book alone at the Fraser Arms Hotel and left around 12:30 a.m. Then she went to another bar, the Rock Cellar Pub, where a waitress saw her leave with a man between 1:30 and 1:40 a.m. The waitress was able to describe what Gillian was wearing that night, a sweater with red trim, and she was carrying a pink book. The police released a composite of the man she left with, based on the waitress's description. The witness said that the man had an olive complexion. He was 28 or 29 years old, with dark curly hair, thick eyebrows, and dark eyes. The unknown man was also reportedly 6 feet tall. The man was not considered a suspect at the time, but the Vancouver police thought that he could assist them. Over time, and after many tips, the case lost momentum. A strange twist in the case occurred 8 months after the murder. The Vancouver police received an anonymous letter that was sent from Washington, D.C. The letter was dated November 15, 1993, and it was addressed to the Chief of Detectives in the Homicide Department of the Vancouver Police Department. The typed letter reads in part, "Dear Sir, I am writing about the murder of Gillian Fuller on March 4, 1993, for which there has not been an arrest, to say that, if you have not already done so, you should consider. The next part of the letter and most of the letter's body were redacted by the police. The last part of the letter reads, "While I would like to think that if I gave my name, you would hold it in confidence, I hope you will not discount the information or ideas in this letter because I write anonymously." The police released images of the letter with the redacted portion to the public. Unfortunately, it did not provide any leads to Jillian's murder. In 1995, the police offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Vancouver Police Constable Anne Drennan told the press, "There's somebody out there who knows something. The suspect has talked to somebody, been bragging, or drunk somewhere, and blurted it out." In 2013, 20 years after Jillian's murder, Vancouver police again reached out to the public. "Every couple of years, we review these cases with a fresh set of eyes," said Vancouver Police Department Media Officer Sergeant Ryan Fincham. But if any leads were generated, they didn't lead to an arrest. Around that time, Jillian's sister, Jane, released a statement on behalf of the Fuller family. It reads, "The toll that my sister's death has caused my family over the last 20 years is truly immeasurable. It casts a dark shadow on our family that has never been lifted. Her loss has left a deep wound in all our lives, and the fact that her killer was never found means that wound will always be unhealed." As the 30th anniversary of Jillian Fuller's murder approaches in 2023, the case is still unsolved. Number 1. Bethlen Barr. In the autumn of 1977, 6-year-old Bethlen Barr lived in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, with her mother, father, and older brother. She was a second grader at Johnson Elementary School. On the afternoon of November 23, 1977, school was dismissed early for Thanksgiving break. Beth normally walked home with a friend. However, a parent picked that friend up, so Beth was left to make the 10-minute walk home alone. Tragically, Beth did not make it home. A couple witnesses last saw her walking towards her home. An elderly neighbor saw her talking to a middle-aged man. Then the neighbors saw the man carry her into a blue sedan with Ohio license plates. Another witness waiting at a bus stop saw a man in a blue car with Ohio license plates make a U-turn and pull up beside Beth. This witness took note of the license plate numbers. Beth's disappearance set off a large search with officers rotating in 12-hour shifts. The around-the-clock search yielded no clues about Beth's whereabouts. Police investigated every tip, reportedly over 6,000, that were called in. They went door to door and used volunteers and helicopters to aid the search. They even consulted a nationally known psychic. A composite sketch of a white man in his 40s with tinted sunglasses was released. Beth's parents struggled to find a motive for their daughter's abduction. Her father, Charles Barr, was a police officer, and he didn't believe it was a reprisal from his police work. The police tracked down the blue car to a vehicle rental service based at a motel in Wilkins Township, about 5 miles from where Beth was kidnapped. Employees at the rental service said that the car wasn't rented out on the day of the kidnapping. Based on some tips and the composite drawing, the police made an arrest in December 1977. The 34-year-old man was also picked out of a police lineup by a witness who saw Beth that afternoon. But the man had receipts verifying that he was in a different city about 60 miles away on the day of the kidnapping. After that, the case went cold and no trace of Beth was found. On March 22, 1979, nearly 16 months after the disappearance, a man walking his dog found a child's body covered in dirt and leaves near a Monroeville cemetery. The police recovered the body and identified the remains as 6-year-old Beth Barr. They were able to identify her by the clothes she wore on the day of her disappearance, a red pantsuit, plaid coat, and tennis shoes. The family's dentist also examined dental records and was able to confirm her identity. An autopsy revealed that the child suffered multiple stab wounds to the chest. The time of death was not determined. The police followed up on dozens of tips they received, but those all fizzled out, and eventually the case went cold. The large amount of time between Beth's disappearance and her body's recovery put the investigators at a disadvantage. Over 300 people attended Beth's funeral. Investigators kept pressing on for the next several decades, but they hit a snag when water destroyed some of the evidence during a 1996 flood. However, some crucial evidence was still saved. In November 2020, Beth's mother, Donna Barr, publicly spoke about the case for the first time. She hoped to keep her daughter's memory alive. "We never got to experience her going to school dances, going to college, and I'm sure she would have gotten married and had children," Donna said. In February 2021, after WPXI Channel 11 in Pittsburgh aired a story about the case, the police received a mysterious letter. The anonymous, handwritten letter was 4 pages long, and it named a suspect. The letter, in part, reads, "In 1977, I was one of many who went to search for the beautiful, innocent little girl. This case has affected me my entire adult life." After admitting that the author knows Beth's parents, they go on to write, "I'm wondering, and have been, if someone is deceased, yet worked as a police officer, and perhaps their fingerprints/DNA could possibly help solve this horrendous, heartbreaking case, so that Beth's soul/spirit and Charlie and Donna could finally have closure. I feel so terrible at even writing and sending this to you." In the letter, the writer says that a former police officer, who is now deceased, is the killer. The writer then goes off on a few tangents, but ends with, "I am not ending this by signing my name. I will come forward if this is ever proven. I vowed years ago that I will not stop when it comes to Beth Lynn Barr, and seeing Donna Barr on the news last night, I knew I had to reach out to you. Please take me seriously. Thank you. God bless and stay safe." Bobby Payne, the case investigator in 1977, saw no real proof in the letter's accusation. Donna Barr, Beth's mother, was shocked by the accusation. Donna said, "I find it hard to believe for a lot of reasons. I was completely shocked. You know, very nice guy. So I don't know what to think about that." The author's identity is still a mystery. While the letter didn't lead to any closure, it renewed interest in the case. The police and Beth's family are hoping that even after 45 years, the case will be solved.